It was a brisk winter morning as the Senate was called to convene, but they would not be meeting in the Senate House. Instead, the weary senators slowly shuffled beyond the Pomerium of Rome to the Temple of Belladonna in order to meet the victorious Sulla. With the civil war over in Italy, Sulla was once again left in legal quagmire. He held no elected office and could not enter the city as a general. Unlike his first march, he decided not to cross the Pomerium to bolster his image as a law-abiding citizen, so the Senate was forced to convene outside the city to hear him out. Once everyone had arrived, Sulla began recounting his valiant efforts in the war against Mithridates, listing the battles he'd won, the armies he'd crushed, and the kingdoms he'd conquered. Importantly, the civil war was not mentioned, but as this was going on, several thousand Samnite prisoners were led within earshot of the temple and brutally massacred. The senators listened to the howling in horror, and when one of them asked Sulla what was going on, he merely said, "Some prisoners are being punished." He then declared his position on what was to be done with his enemies. Anyone who had continued to oppose him after the defection of Asiaticus's army would be destroyed, with the exception of soldiers and commoners, who were not to be harmed. He was soon asked who exactly that meant, and Sulla told them he would get back to them on that, so he spent the night drafting a list of enemies of the Republic. Dawn broke over Rome, and the citizens woke to see a list of 80 names posted in the Forum. The men on this list were declared enemies of the Republic and marked for death. Many on the list were high-ranking anti-Sullans, and it was a fairly lenient total considering the chaos of the past few years. Finally, the tension had broken and all of Rome, aside from the poor sods on the hit list, breathed a sigh of relief. The people slept easy that night, but when dawn broke over the city again, another list had appeared in the Forum. This one had 220 names. The day after that, there were over 500 names. Anyone caught harbouring an enemy of the Republic was to be executed as well. The Republic was soon engulfed in a reign of terror far exceeding anything yet known to the Romans. The situation was made worse by the fact that not only did Sulla pay a bounty for the heads of the proscribed men, but also auctioned off the dead man's property. This led to many people being added to the list simply because of their wealth. Crassus himself executed a man simply because he wanted one of his estates. The already murky business of the proscriptions was given a sickening twist as men began to add their own personal vendettas into the mix. Corruption became the byword of Sulla's proscriptions. The most morbid episode of the slaughter concerned Sulla himself. At one point in the chaos, a man was brought before Sulla for harbouring enemies of the state, and he was none other than Sulla's next-door neighbour from decades ago, before he had actually begun his political career. The man begged for his life, appealing to their old friendship, and eventually Sulla recognised him. He was thrown from the Tarpeian Rock that very afternoon. Meanwhile, Pompey was hunting down the final high-ranking anti-Sullans, and eventually caught up to Carbo in Sicily. Carbo was still technically that year's consul, but Pompey paid him no mind and had him unceremoniously executed. The chaos was finally brought to an end when Sulla declared that no more names would be added to the list after the 1st of June. Thousands had been slaughtered, former consuls were treated no differently than petty criminals, and the rule of law was thrown to the wind. Violence like this was not new to the Republic, but Sulla swamped Rome in it on a scale not seen before. People often abused their influence to have their opponents proscribed, but the flip side of that was that people could also have names taken off the list. The most famous case of this was with the as yet unknown Gaius Julius Caesar. Gaius had committed 2 fatal crimes in the eyes of Sulla. 1, he was the nephew of Marius, and 2, he had married Cinna's daughter. Sulla demanded that he divorce his wife, but Caesar, in a move that blurs the line between bravery and suicidal tendencies, refused. The young man was thus forced into exile, rushing from safe haven to safe haven as Sulla's goons hunted him down. Fortunately for Caesar, he had friends in Sulla's inner circle, and soon enough Sulla relented and pardoned Caesar, but not before commenting that, in Caesar there are many Mariuses. But as Tom Holland wryly puts it, if Caesar resembled anyone, it was not Marius. Eventually the massacre was brought to a close, and Sulla prepared himself for his next task, restoring the very Republic itself. The Senate had conferred upon him the name Felix, meaning the Fortunate, and after much deliberation, Sulla decided upon the one office that would be adequate for the programs he had in mind. He decided to revive an office that had not seen action in over a century. He decided to make himself dictator. The senators must have felt queasy at the thought, but Sulla could no longer be opposed. Lucius Cornelius Sulla was declared dictator for the making of laws and the settling of the constitution. In this way, Sulla legitimised his position with the ancient office and smoothed his ascension to power. He followed nearly all of the dictatorial traditions, appointing a master of horse to serve as his lieutenant, but in one regard Sulla's dictatorship differed from those of the past. His term had no expiration date. In effect, Sulla was dictator for life. Ultimate power now rested in his hands alone, and he was ready to put it to work. Sulla's main aim was to tip the political scales in favour of the aristocratic Senate. To this end he enacted several reforms. Firstly, the Senate was enlarged from 300 to 600 members, stacking it with his friends and then with friends of friends. Then he made it so that laws first had to be put before the Senate before they could be voted on by the assemblies. Finally, he made the less democratic centuriate assembly responsible for all voting. He also worked to castrate the tribunate of the plebs. A tribune could no longer veto acts coming from the Senate, and anyone who became a tribune was barred from any further political office. In Sulla's perfect world, the tribunate could no longer be used to challenge senatorial supremacy. The cursus honorum, formerly an unwritten set of guidelines, became rigidly enforced in law, while gaps between magistracies were implemented. 2 years must pass before running for any office again, and 10 years had to pass before running for the same office. Repeat consulships like those of Marius were outlawed. The sheer amount of magistracies also increased. Quaestors were increased from 8 to 20, while praetors increased from 6 to 8. The increased number of government officials meant that provincial assignments could be shorter to account for the increased turnover. Politicians could no longer expect to hoard the riches of Rome's foreign provinces for long. He also made sure that the juries of the Roman law courts could only be filled with men of senatorial rank, giving them a dominant position in the legal system. Meanwhile, beyond the walls of Rome, Sulla settled thousands of his veterans on land taken from Italians. In other news, Sulla demolished Rome's ancient Senate house and replaced it with a fancy new one, unmoved by the wailing of the senators themselves, and then pushed the pomerium of Rome further outwards. Sulla was unsanctimonious in his refurbishment of the Republic. He also took the time to scatter Marius's ashes into the Tiber, a final revenge for the one enemy who escaped him. Sulla kept his promise to the Italians. Everyone in Italy was now granted citizenship, and just like that, the struggle of the Italians faded away. Beyond Italy, there were still several matters left outstanding after the Civil War. The anti-Sullan cause was battered but not destroyed, and while Sulla successfully reasserted control over most of the West, several anti-Sullans led by Quintus Sertorius holed themselves up in Spain, where they continued to resist for nearly a decade. Meanwhile in Asia Minor, the Second Mithridatic War had flared up. Unlike the First War, Rome had no real qualms with Mithridates, and Sulla was more embarrassed by it than anything else. He sent an envoy to sort things out between Mithridates and the local governor responsible, eventually hammering out a peace that would last for 2 decades. Then, in 81, Sulla began the process of shedding power. After all, Sulla was at heart a conservative republican. He viewed himself more as a doctor than a tyrant, curing the Republic's ailments before leaving the scene. To make his intentions clear, he ran for the consulship of 80 alongside Metellus Pius, and then went to the Forum and abruptly announced that he was resigning as dictator. He dismissed his dictatorial bodyguards and went home. Unfortunately, as he walked home, he was hit with the thing politicians fear most. For the entire journey back, he was mercilessly heckled by one boy, who followed him the entire way back. But despite what the cynics in Rome said, Sulla was sincere in his republicanism. He governed Rome for 80 as consul, but afterwards he didn't even bother to visit his assigned province. Instead, Sulla, Rome's first dictator in over a century, spent his retirement partying in his villa and composing his memoirs. One day in 78, Sulla caught a local official skimming off the treasury, and while he was bollocking the official, an ulcer inside him burst and he collapsed to the floor, blood spurting from his mouth. He was carried home in agony, where he died the following morning. The dictator was dead. So what can we make of him? Sulla's career was one of contradictions. He ran roughshod over Republican traditions while claiming to be their standard bearer. He demolished Rome's ancient Senate house with striking unsentimentality and dropped a grander one on its foundations. Yet for all the effort he put into his new constitution, it would not stand the test of time. This was for a few reasons. Firstly, his reign of terror had left many enemies who would oppose Sulla and everything he had built, since the sons of proscribed men were forbidden from entering politics. This resentment led to a short-lived rebellion in 78 led by Consul Lepidus. The ban was eventually lifted, but the resentment stayed. In short, Sulla's constitution had many enemies, while Sulla's divided successors, men like Crassus, Pompey and Pius, didn't have the energy to fight the horde of opponents Sulla had left in his wake. Restoring the power of the Tribunate of the Plebs became a rallying cry for the populares in the wake of Sulla's death, and men could base a career on pressing for its restoration. Ironically, Sulla's demolition of the Tribunate of the Plebs would be reversed in 70 during the consulship of Pompey and Crassus, and once again it became a populare path to power. 70 also saw the senators lose their monopoly on Roman juries. Sulla's land distribution policy only led to the rise of large slave estates, the so-called latifundia, as his soldiers quickly sold their land to rich magnates. His reforms aimed at concentrating as much power as possible in the hands of the Senate, as a counterbalance to the power of the populares. In his mind, this would restore the stability of the Republic, as the Senate's power was reaffirmed. But in reality it only galvanised populist opposition and led to greater turmoil. Besides, anything that Sulla tried to change in the Republic would forever be overshadowed by the defining event of Sulla's life. He is remembered in the minds of most today as the dictator that marched on Rome, not the lawgiver, and that's quite telling of his effect on Roman politics. Sulla rested easy in his belief that he had restored Rome, but his career would be second only to Caesar in terms of damage done to the Republic. Despite his ostensibly good intentions, Sulla had fatally weakened the Roman Republic. In his attempts to restore order, he had fatally undermined the Mos Maiorum, the Roman traditions of what one could and couldn't do, and in future generations, ambitious generals would ask, if Sulla could, why can't I? Clearly, they couldn't find a very convincing answer, for within just 4 decades of Sulla's death, the Republic was destroyed, crushed beneath the feet of the Caesars.